is Joel Iverson. I'm with Information Technology Services here at the university. I would like to welcome you this morning to this Dissonance event. The Dissonance event series is actually celebrating its 1-year anniversary 2 days ago. A year ago, we had our first event. It was Apple versus the FBI. It was a panel discussion that's available on our website. If you'd like to watch that or any of our past events, we've had a total of 5, and we're very excited to bring this panel discussion to you today. It will be the last panel discussion we have for this academic year. And we have Tim Maurer here to thank for helping to organize the panels, and Tim will be serving as our moderator. First, I'd like to thank the organizing groups on campus that have helped the Dissonance series take off in its first year. The Bentley Historical Library, the College of Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Computer Science Department, the Law School, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, Information and Technology Services, U of M Privacy and Technology Law Association, and the School of Information. And today's event is called Conflict and Cyberspace, Emerging Challenges and Norms. Tim Maurer is a fellow from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has also been a visiting scholar in the Ford School. And he co-directs the Cyber Policy Institute, and his research focuses on cyberspace and international affairs. Tim Maurer.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here on this beautiful day in Michigan, which I define as if there is no snow, it's a beautiful day in Michigan. I'm very excited about this event, and I think we have a terrific panel that brings together different faculties from the university, and we are co-hosting it with the Carnegie Endowment, which is based in Washington, D.C., where I spent most of my time. And I would now like to jump into introducing you to the panelists. We will have a panel discussion that will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So if something pops up during the conversation that you'd like to ask, or you have prepared questions already, please reserve those for then. If you could turn off your cell phones, and also be aware that this event is being recorded and live streamed. So just when you ask questions, please make sure to identify yourself and to let us know what brought you here today. For those on the live stream, apologies that we are starting a little early. I was alerted at the beginning of the event that Michigan academic time is 10 minutes delayed to the time on the clock for the event itself, so we wanted to make sure to give students enough time to join us this morning. With that, let me now introduce you to our distinguished panelists today. To my left is Professor Alex Halderman, who is a professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department here at the University of Michigan, and director of the Computer Security and Society Institute here at the University of Michigan, the center. Alex focuses on computer security and privacy, and many of his papers that he has published in the last several years have won the award for best paper at the conference they were presented. And I think most important for the event today, Alex has focused on the question of hacking of election systems long before it made front page news, and was actually trying to raise the alarm bell around this. And then, thanks to events last year, I think has gotten a lot more attention for the important research he's done in the past few years. To his left is Theodore Nemeroff, who is a senior advisor at the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the Department of State. His office is the lead in the U.S. government writ large for developing a strategic framework for international cybersecurity. Teddy was working at a law firm in Washington, D.C. prior to joining the State Department, and focused on national security and telecommunications law in that capacity. He is a graduate of Columbia University and also worked at a democracy NGO in South Africa before joining the State Department and focusing on cybersecurity. Professor Bob Axelrod is a professor at the Political Science Department here at the University of Michigan, and also at the Ford School of Public Policy. His accomplishments are too numerous to recount all here, but he's the Walgreen Professor for the Study of Human Understanding, and among his many accomplishments includes winning the MacArthur Genius Award that I think many of you are familiar with. In 2004, he received the National Medal for Science by President Obama, and he was the youngest political scientist to be inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. To his left is Nadiya Kostyuk, who is a current PhD professor at the Political Science Department here and at the Ford School for Public Policy. She will be leaving us soon here in Ann Arbor to become a pre-doc at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Belfer Center. And Nadiya has been focusing specifically at the use of offensive cyber operations in eastern Ukraine and how offensive cyber operations have been used as part of the kinetic conflict on the ground as well. She was a program coordinator at the East-West Institute before joining the University of Michigan, and is a fellow with the East-West Institute, which does a lot of work on this space as well. My job today will be limited to being the moderator and kicking us off with a couple of questions. We will try to make this more of a moderated discussion and not necessarily having opening statements. And to kick us off, I'd like to ask Teddy, your office has been really the lead in the US government for developing a strategic framework for thinking about cybersecurity at a global level. Your office is fairly new in the context of the department itself, so it'd be great to have you walk us through why was the office created, what was the rationale behind it, and what is the current strategy that's in place for the US government to try to improve the security environment that we currently experience.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, just as spring seems to be springing out here in Ann Arbor. Get to go a few weeks back in terms of the allergies, so it's a little farther. Spring is a little farther on. We have our own pollen to deal with there. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So as Tim mentioned, I work at the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the Department of State. Our office was established in 2011 as part of an effort to begin to coordinate better our foreign policy around cyber issues. Cyber policy, there are many different aspects to kind of our foreign policy on cyber, and many different parts of our department that work on these issues. To name a few, we have internet governance, issues around how the internet is actually run. We have issues around internet freedom and human rights online. There is cybercrime and how we cooperate with other governments to fight cybercrime, which is often transnational and therefore requires international cooperation. There is what we call cybersecurity due diligence, which is essentially how we as governments cooperate with each other around cybersecurity, keeping the network secure. And from our perspective, involves a lot of work around capacity building, because we, in an interconnected network, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And then lastly, and this is I think the topic we're going to focus on a bit more, we look at the issue of conflict among states and the role of cyberspace and cyber capabilities as potentially a destabilizer that might contribute to conflict among states. This is an area we refer to as international security in cyberspace. So as Tim mentioned, the State Department, working with the rest of the US government, has been working for the last few years, really actually a decade preceding the founding of our office, to develop a framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And the concern that we have, and I think it's a concern that many share, is that as more and more governments are developing capabilities, military and other capabilities to operate in cyberspace, that this creates the risk for instability, for misperception when an incident occurs, for escalation and potentially conflict. There are a lot of somewhat unique traits about cyberspace that can lead to this. This includes the fact that it's difficult often to attribute an attack, the fact that even if you can see an activity happening, it's often difficult if you see code on a system to figure out what the purpose of that code is. The fact that every one of us, we all have computers, whether sitting on the desk here, in our pockets, hooked up to our electrical grid, the fact that we all feel very vulnerable as a result of this. And all of this, we think, sort of adds a new dimension to all of this, we believe, adds a new dimension to international relations and creates new foreign policy challenges. So what we've been trying to do over the last few years is promote a framework And there are two key elements that we've been promoting up till now. The first is around getting consensus among governments about what constitutes responsible behavior. Why don't we go? You can hear me, right? Getting consensus around what constitutes responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and we've been negotiating this in expert level fora at the UN and trying to promote consensus more broadly. The bedrock of our approach in this area is that international law, the same international law that applies to state conduct anywhere else, applies to state behavior in cyberspace. And seeking affirmation on that and trying to deepen our discussion about how it applies. In addition, we have been promoting, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more, some additional what we call voluntary norms of state behavior that we think that states should abide by, particularly during peacetime. I think the most well-known peacetime norm that we've been promoting has been around that states should not disrupt the delivery of services by critical infrastructure to the public using cyber-enabled means. So that's the first big element of what we've been promoting right now. Building a consensus about what constitutes responsible state behavior. Secretary Tillerson, during his confirmation hearing, spoke about the importance of norms. The new Homeland Security Advisor has spoken about it. It's been a long-standing piece of our approach. The second piece gets a little bit less play in the press and in the conversations because it's maybe a little less sexy, but it's very important and it's very practical. This is what we call confidence-building measures. These are practical measures that we encourage states to develop to improve transparency about what their intentions are in cyberspace, to create means for cooperation. So one example of a transparency measure is getting states to publish cyber strategies or white papers about their military doctrines, about what their goals are in cyberspace, how they intend to operate, helping, since we can't actually observe often what governments are doing in cyberspace, helping to sort of fill that gap with statements. An example of a cooperative measure, these are often communications channels that can be used in an incident. These are not technical channels. For example, there are CERT-to-CERT channels where incident responders can talk to each other. These are more of a political and diplomatic nature so that states can talk when an incident occurs and try to understand better what's happening and how they can work to resolve it. So that's broadly what we've been doing. A little bit our priorities, I think, going forward continue to be broadening and deepening what we do. But I think you can also expect, I think, the conversation to move a little bit more towards the question of deterrence and consequences. We have, now that we're building a sense of consensus about what is responsible state behavior, well then what happens when certain states don't act consistent with that consensus? How should other like-minded states respond to that? So those are the kinds of questions I think I can see us pursuing a bit further in the future.
Great, thank you. You've already noticed that Teddy has used the term cybersecurity in most of the description of what his office does. What's important to bear in mind is that this, within the global discussion, that some of the other states that are involved in this, for example, Russia or China, use the term information security in juxtaposition to the term cybersecurity as Teddy's using it. And that's primarily because some of these other states have a broader definition of cybersecurity to not just be more focused on the technical aspects, but to include content. So this comes in especially as we talk about more of the type of like information operations or the type of operations where you're not causing necessarily a physical effect, but where content is at play. Which leads me to Nadiya, because Nadiya, you've done a lot of research focusing specifically on the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And partly what Teddy just outlined in terms of the US strategy focusing on these voluntary norms was a response to the Russian proposal for an information security treaty in the late 1990s, where Russia proposed we should have a treaty on cybersecurity, which was opposed partly because of that broad definition. In your research, what have you seen how the offensive cyber operations have actually been used as part of the conflict in Ukraine and with Russia on the ground, and what have been your findings and lessons learned from that experience?
So when the conflict in Ukraine started, a lot of experts, they were hoping to see similar situation that took place in Estonia and Georgia. Basically, they were hoping to see a lot of cyber attacks that would have disruptive purposes. And they were to some extent at the beginning of the conflict, but then what we saw is the decline in frequency of cyber attacks for the purpose of disruption and espionage. So our research and field work and interviews with the experts in Ukraine, Russia, as well as in the US, gave three potential explanations why we saw a decline of such attacks. And the first one was the lack of targets. Specifically, a lot of critical infrastructure in Ukraine is very old. It doesn't have online access. So experts were saying that the targets, it's very hard to attack targets who cannot be accessed remotely. However, some experts were very skeptical to this explanation, and they say that weakness of infrastructure security, it makes this target very easy. And this is something what we saw in 2015 and 2016 attacks on the electric power grids in Ukraine. And these attacks make one of these explanations not as good as possible. The second explanation was a lack of audience. So in Ukraine, there are only 44% of people have internet access, and most people who use the internet, they use it for social media purposes. There are very few of them who use like phone line banking or anything what we do in the US. So a low-level attack that would disrupt the website of the Ministry of Defense or of the President of Ukraine would have less of the effect when on regular masses. Versus the attack that would propaganda campaign that would display images of crucified babies or raped women in the conflict zone. So we can see that change in Russia's strategies towards more propaganda campaigns displaying such images to get effect on regular masses. And the last one, the last reason was lack of incentive. Since Ukraine uses a lot of software and hardware from Russia, and they bought this during the Soviet time, a lot of experts, they mentioned that there was need for them to hack because they already have access to. And this access, a lot of the cyber espionage campaigns that started in Ukraine in 2010 supports this kind of argument. Additionally, another change that happened was the change in the presidential administration. So with the switch of the head of presidential administration in 2011, and Vyacheslav Voloshin, who was the new person, he basically started promoting usage of social media and mass media for information campaigns. And social media and mass media, as you know, is very, very, very controlled in Russia. So in the case of Ukraine, this changed from cyber attacks for disruption and espionage purpose to propaganda campaign that had very, very vivid effect. Because usually when you think about cyber attacks that have disruption purpose, usually they will mobilize your opponent. But when you have propaganda campaign, they will try to bring this seed of disagreement between different groups. And this is what we saw in Ukraine. There were two groups. There were people who supported the side of the Ukrainian government, and there were people who really supported rebels and pro-Russian side. And another thing that I would like to mention about the advantage, so-called, of the propaganda campaigns is that when you have a cyber attack, even though we know attribution is very difficult, but it's possible to pinpoint to a specific actor who has done it, right? But when you have a propaganda campaign on a large scale that involves wide usage of all mass media sources and social media, it's very hard to pin down who actually is behind this and whether it's actually a campaign. So this is what we saw in the case of Ukraine.
Great, thank you. And as you just heard, the Ukraine conflict is interesting because we had this outage that occurred in December 2015, which raised some questions around whether this normal critical infrastructure that had been agreed to earlier that year was actually effective or not, when 6 months later, all of a sudden you have a power outage in Western Ukraine for 6 hours that was the result of a malware. And we might get back to that in a second. But the Ukraine conflict is also interesting because during the presidential election, the commission was hacked. And Ukraine was actually one of the first instances where we had seen an offensive cyber operation being used targeting specifically an election. So Alex, you've been working on this for many years now, specifically in the context of electoral systems. What struck you about what happened here in the US last year? Were you at all surprised that this has happened? And what did you learn from that experience now as we move forward with the French and the German elections and a lot of the Europeans who are very anxious about this potentially happening again?
Right, so there were a number of interesting things that happened during the 2016 election that we can talk about. Looking back at what happened prior to the election, the selective leaks and attack attempts, successful attacks against the DNC, against John Podesta, that resulted in information being leaked to the public and to the media that was damaging to the Democratic side, which is part of a campaign that the intelligence community has labeled an attempt by high-ranking Russian officials to interfere with the politics of the presidential election. So starting there, one interesting thing about all of this is it's not actually a disinformation campaign. It's true information that is being selectively leaked. And I think that's a fascinating phenomenon to think about, because in a great sense, it's a challenge to this internet program of radical transparency that WikiLeaks and other groups have been promoting, that we should have government-related information made available to the public in all circumstances. Might be Julian Assange's line about this. But here, if it's being used by another government in order to interfere with the politics of one country, I think that's a fascinating phenomenon, and it really speaks to the limits of what that program of radical transparency can do in order to improve the public discourse rather than distort it. In terms of those specific attacks and the technology, well, they weren't very sophisticated attacks. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, especially in small and widely distributed organizations like political campaigns. If anyone has ever had their password phished or something like that, that's basically what these attacks amounted to. They're low-tech, very common kinds of attacks, but the simple attacks worked in these cases, and that's part of the disturbing thing about it. This kind of leak, this kind of attack could happen to just so many organizations. And given that they appear to be successful, I think we're going to see a lot more instances like them in future campaigns. The simplest thing that, ironically, the very simple things could have also prevented these attacks. I think if the DNC had just hosted their email with Google, like the University of Michigan does, they wouldn't have had this problem. They had just turned on two-factor authentication and hosted their email with a low-cost cloud provider. So simple defenses can work against those attacks too, but far too few organizations apply them. Now, another question that we might ask is whether the Russian influence campaign stopped on election day. And so far, we've seen no evidence that there were attacks that targeted the machinery of the election. Now, whether they stopped or not, I don't know. Even though we don't have any evidence, it does seem strange that an organized and sophisticated campaign to manipulate the election result wouldn't go beyond the politics and also target the machinery. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in our voting machinery too, maybe more than even I realized before the election day. So our voting system is very distributed, and that's often seen as an advantage. And maybe that was enough of an apparent advantage to deter an attack on election day. By that I mean just that most voting in our country is organized at state and local levels, that different counties, even within the same state, can have different and sometimes disconnected systems, and that the machines we use to vote are usually not connected directly to the internet. All of that sounds on paper like a good model for a system, but in practice, many of these things break down. So the fact that the system is widely distributed means that if an election is very close and turns on just a small number of states, an attacker can pick any one of a large set of states to flip by electronic means and thereby change the outcome. So the attacker now gets to select from many targets which is the most vulnerable. Beyond that, even though the machines themselves are not directly connected to the internet, they're programmed from central computer systems, either at the county level or in many states, including Michigan, commonly from a third-party vendor. And those systems are sometimes connected to the internet. So in Michigan, typically, the county or the Secretary of State's office will email information about the ballot design to a small business, a 10, 20-person company, sometimes out of state, which will program that data onto memory cards that are shipped to the polling places and placed into the voting machines. If an attacker can compromise one of these small vendors, they can manipulate the data on the memory cards in ways that cause the machines to misbehave on election day. And by attacking just two small companies that probably were not even on the radar of authorities prior to the election, an attacker could have changed votes in 75% of Michigan counties. So the only way we could have reliably and conclusively detected an attack like that would be by reviewing the physical evidence of the election. That is, the paper ballots were available, we're doing forensics on specific voting machines. To my knowledge, no close state that might have been targeted by an attacker did sufficient forensics to conclusively detect an attack. Very little of the paper was analyzed except as a part of the recounts that were initiated, and even those recounts stopped short of manually reviewing enough paper to conclude with certainty that the votes in Michigan or Wisconsin were not manipulated. Now, I don't think those votes were manipulated, and I didn't on election day either, because we've never seen that happen in this country, and it would be really a new phenomenon to observe such an attack here. But there's a chance that some manipulation or attempts took place. And let me give one hypothetical scenario, and I have no concrete evidence to believe this is true. But suppose that an attack attempt was organized to discredit the election in the case that Hillary Clinton won. And that would involve not necessarily as much work or as much compromise as one that would change the outcome, but just to cast doubt on the conclusion. If such an attack were organized, then perhaps that just would have been done, but not announced when the real election results showed a victory more favorable to the Russian influence campaign. So we may never know whether there was hacking of specific machines or systems in 2016. But what I worry about most is what will happen in 2018 and 2020, because the possibility for an outcome-changing attack is certainly there.
Well, things got scary real fast. I think it's been less than half an hour into the event. Thanks, Alex, for that. Bob, I remember we had lunch a couple of months ago, and we talked about the DNC hack and what was unfolding, and you brought up the analogy to Watergate. I know you've thought a lot about analogies to this space. In fact, you've written an entire article about analogies for this. What do you think was similar and what was different comparing the DNC hack and Watergate? And more broadly than that, why do you think is hacking really something that ought to be of concern to us from an international security perspective?
Right. Well, the DNC attack in 2016 was by cyber means, and the DNC attack in 1972 became known as the Watergate scandal because it was a physical attack by burglars getting into the Democratic National Committee's offices on behalf of the Richard Nixon campaign. The exact purpose is still not clear, but apparently it was to prevent a scandal. That is to say, Nixon was worried that there were documents the DNC had that might damage his campaign. What happened in that case was they were caught by a guard who was walking down the corridors, and that led to the arrest of the people that were doing the attack, and that led to their trial, where the judge, they said that if they didn't tell who ordered them to do it, they would get a really stiff sentence, like 20 years instead of perhaps 1 year for a first offender in a burglary. And so that worked, that the burglars themselves gave evidence that it was from the White House, and that led to them going to jail and eventually to Richard Nixon resigning the presidency. So we have here a system where the domestic law enforcement involving guards, police, judges, plea bargains, investigations, and then eventually the resignation of the president, a system that that worked after the fact, including good attribution. Now the DNC hack, of course, was not physical, it was by cyber means, and the CIA attributed to Putin himself, saying this would not have been, it must have been from Russia and it could not have been done without approval at the highest level. The purpose appears to be to discredit the candidate Hillary Clinton by revealing emails from the DNC that would prove embarrassing to her. In particular, what was embarrassing was that the DNC was supposed to be neutral between the candidates for president, and the other one being Bernie Sanders, the other leading one, and it was clear from the emails that they weren't, that they were working on behalf of Hillary and they weren't being neutral at all in that Democratic campaign, and that was an embarrassment. Now whether that affected the votes is not clear. It probably was it was one of about 1,000 things that were going back and forth of why you should vote one way or the other. My guess is it certainly wouldn't have been a scale that would have affected the outcome, but it could have, but it was an embarrassment, especially since it was revealed very late in the game. Now it led to 3 different things. One was that a minor effect on the vote and an effect on embarrassment of the candidate. And the second was that the Obama administration then, after attributing it to Russian leadership, expelled 35 Russian diplomats who they identified as spies. That's a substantial number. Normally, in the response to declaring people not persona non grata, as the other country declares an equal number and throws them out of the country, actually Putin did not do that, which is striking, and probably because at the time he was hopeful for good relations with President Trump and didn't want to retaliate. So we had this sanctioning of Russia, but in a way that doesn't seem to be large enough to deter the kinds of things that Alex was worried about in the future. The third effect is it led to, or contributed to a series of investigations into the relationships between the Trump campaign and Russia, which are still ongoing in the Senate and the House both, and we'll see whether those are, and the FBI, to see whether those are serious investigations and whether, if they are serious, what they find. So that's the effects of the DNC hack are still playing out. So one of the implications is the comparison of these 2 attacks on the very same target, and both for information purposes, is that the domestic law enforcement is much more powerful than international enforcement of norms or deterrence. So in the international sense, we don't have a central court or essential authorities to deal with this. We do it by not only trying to promote norms, but trying to deter bad behavior. And the main way of doing that is by punishing bad behavior so they won't do it again. And interestingly enough, the Obama administration retaliated in a completely different domain of diplomatic expulsions. It's conceivable they've done other things that they have not announced, but I think it's likely that if this sort of thing happens again at a larger scale, though, the American administration will find other, perhaps more drastic measures. But then, of course, there's always a fear that if you do something substantial, they'll retaliate, especially if they feel it was unjustified. Another issue is about attribution and political leadership. There's sort of two levels of attribution that are often not distinguished. One is where did the attack come from? And the second is who's responsible. So to say that the attack came from Russia is not the same as saying that the Russian government is responsible. And even saying somebody in the Russian government was responsible is not the same as saying the Russian leadership is responsible. However, I think it's safe to say, as the CIA implied, that if it's an attack that has major political significance, it would not have been done by a small part of the bureaucracy having a bright idea and acting on its own. Both in the United States, Russia, and China, there's really quite good supervision of parts of the organization not acting without high-level approval. And in the Russian case, that would be probably Putin personally if they're messing with the United States. So there we do the attribution not by direct technical means, but rather by political understanding of the way the system works in that country. Now, another contrast is what the public sees as going on. In the burglary, the DNC, it took months to unravel, but eventually even Nixon's supporters accepted the idea that he ordered it. But with the DNC hack, it's widely believed that it came from Russia, but it's not universally accepted that it must have come from the highest levels of the Russian government. And that's one of the issues being investigated. And so the attribution in cyberspace, even when it's technically quite good, still leaves open, in many cases, the question of responsibility, which is important to know who you try to deter in the future. And so these two attacks on exactly the same institution, both for getting information out of it, led to quite different results. In the domestic case, it led to the president's resignation. In the international case, it led to some minor retaliation and investigation that may lead somewhere. But basically, it looks like the effort might, as Alex was saying, might happen again.
Teddy, when you started out the event earlier today, you pointed out that in 2015 there was this international agreement, including with Russia, where the states committed not to target critical infrastructure and causing an effect that would disrupt services being provided to the public. We've now heard two instances where Bob and Alex were talking about the DNC hack and the elections, and then Nadiya was talking about Ukraine, and we had the power outage in Ukraine. How did that shape the strategy and your views and your office's views on the norms discussion, and how did you make any adjustments? What was the explanation for why these incidents occurred? And to Bob's point, in the absence of 100% attribution, what can be expected from the Russian government in instances where it's unclear what the involvement was, to clarify what should happen after?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, and this has been a pretty rich and detailed conversation. Just to address the norms question first, I think a critique we hear sometimes from people about what we've done in terms of norms is that the bad guys don't follow the norms. I think the first thing I would say is just because somebody doesn't follow a norm, it doesn't mean a norm doesn't exist. And there are, the world is replete with examples of countries signing on to norms that they don't follow. The fact that they don't follow it doesn't mean that's not a norm. The fact that they don't follow it means that they are acting in a counter-normative way. We promoted the norms not because we thought that it would cause irresponsible states to suddenly act responsibly. We promoted the norms because, and we promote responsible state behavior generally and international law, because we think it helps governments trying to think about these matters that would like to act responsibly to figure out, what are the rules of the road for lack of it's sort of a crude way to say it, but essentially that. And second of all, because we think that it can provide a rallying point for countries that want to see more stability in cyberspace to work together to counter irresponsible behavior by states. So as a general matter, that's how we think about it, and I think that's, I think that's the direction that we're going. Generally, when I said earlier about looking at consequences, is how do we as states that want to see stability in cyberspace work together to promote it and to respond when we see destabilizing activities. I'm not going to, the Ukraine power incident, I'm not going to go too far into that. We had a team in 2015 go there and take a look at it, and we concluded that what happened there after the outage was caused by a cyber attack. For one thing, we thought it was very important to share information that we learned about it with our own industry so that they could better secure their own systems. Whether something violates a norm, you need attribution, you need to know it's a state. There's a question of whether it's taking place during peacetime or not, which is obviously in Ukraine, considering what is happening there. There are questions around that. Whether or not it takes place during peacetime, we're obviously very concerned, and there still are issues under international law about targeting of civilian infrastructure if there's not a military purpose. So, I think there are a lot of concerns there. Regarding influence operations and some of the other, and the DNC, influence operations and propaganda have been around forever. They certainly predate the internet. I think what we see with the internet and cyber capabilities is it sort of greatly increases the ways that you can share that information and spread it. And certainly in the case of the DNC hack, this was a new way of actually obtaining the information. You didn't have to break into the DNC offices. You could do it remotely. So I think you see conduct that's taken place throughout history, really, being carried out through this forum. One thing I will say for sure is that we don't see. We stand by freedom of expression online, and I think the direction we don't believe one should take with it is towards more censorship on the internet to address some of what you were saying. The attribution, the response. I think these are all interesting and complicated issues. As you said, our position all along has been that you don't have to respond. We will respond to cyber incidents using all means of national power. With respect to the DNC, the expulsion of diplomats that occurred on the same day, that was more, I think, a response to some of the other concerns we were having about treatment of diplomats. The other actions we took, though, we imposed economic sanctions. We designated 2 Russian intelligence agencies, as well as several companies and several officials. And at the same time, we also designated 2 Russian cyber criminals for economic sanctions. And we also, as a network defense measure, released a large amount of information, basically about malicious activity we'd seen, in the hope that that network defenders could use that to better defend themselves against the Russian threat. So there's a range of types of activities, of responses that can be taken, and I think a big challenge in this domain is that many of these activities occur below the threshold of a use of force. Above a threshold of a use of force when it's an act of war, I think it's a lot clearer the types of response options. Below the threshold, there's a range of different things you can do, and those were the steps that were taken there.
Nadiya, I want to follow up with you because Teddy just mentioned that they had sent a team to Ukraine to investigate what had happened, and you earlier mentioned that this wasn't really the focus of a lot of the people when you talked to them in Ukraine prior to this happening. What were your thoughts when this occurred, or why did it happen, and how did it fit into the narrative? What was your explanation for it occurring in the first place?
So the first attack on the power grid happened in December of 2015, and it was considered to meet the definition of the act of cyber warfare. That's why it was a very important event, because it was the first event of its kind. Even though the event happened at the end of December, When the evidence was analyzed, it was clear that a lot of preparation took place. So the attack started in spring. So basically, there was a spear phishing campaign. An email was sent to the workers, and they opened it, and this is how the perpetrators were able to get into the control network system. But the power plant in Ukraine is completely separated from the internet by a firewall, so they were not able to get inside of the system. So what happened is that they spent some time collecting intelligence, and they were thinking how they can go around the firewall and how they can get, how they could control the actual power plant. And they were able to do it. Again, they were able to get the credentials by some workers, and because the defensive systems in Ukraine didn't have the two-factor authentication, something that Alex mentioned, they were able to get inside and they were able to control it. So when the attack was happening on December 23rd, 2015, another interesting fact was that the perpetrators, they executed the telephone denial of service attacks for the call centers. So at the time when people didn't have outage, the call centers, they were receiving a lot of traffic coming from Moscow. So the workers at those power plants, electricity plants, they were not aware that people didn't have electricity for this time. So it was very, as you can see, there was a very smart attack, I would say. There were a lot of different pieces. And when, when they look at the evidence, in general, computer scientists, they say there were a few potential actors. They were not just like state or non-state actors. They're saying there was potentially a combination of work between cyber criminals as well as nation-state actors. So of course, the Ukrainian intelligence services, they pinpoint the finger at Russia. They said we are in conflict with Russia and Russia has done it. But they actually didn't provide any evidence that Russia was responsible for it. Another theory that was out there is that this was a response for the Ukrainians physically attacking the power plants that were given power to the Crimea and the Russian naval base, and it happened a few months before that. But when you actually look at the evidence, the preparation for this attack started in spring, so that's not a potential theory. And another explanation is that a few months before that, the Ukrainian parliament was discussing a bill to nationalize a lot of privately owned companies, and some of these privately owned companies, they were owned by the important influential people that have ties to Putin, right, Russian elite. So some people say that an attack on this grid was another, like a signal, you shouldn't pursue this bill. But again, there's no clear evidence of who has done it and who hasn't. But again, one of the potential ways to attribute it is to look at the political context and evidence that we have, something else that Bob has suggested earlier.
I want to stay with this example for another minute, just because going back to Teddy's point, I think it's really important for how these incidents that do not conform with what we consider to be normal behavior or what the norm tries to accomplish, and what the reaction to that is, right? Because like state practice ultimately determines what international norms look like. So Bob, you've written two papers, one on the timing of cyber conflict and one that actually just came out called the blame game, about how do states decide to, one, engage in cyber conflict, and how do they decide when to engage in attribution based on a game theory model. So for all the quantitative nerds in the room, I encourage you to check it out. But what was your analysis of the incident, and what was your analysis or assessment of the US government's reaction to it?
Well, first, the distinction is made between peacetime and wartime in international law, and you've heard its reference here, how the United States government views activities in those two states quite differently. And traditionally, it has implications like you can kill an enemy soldier in wartime, but if you do it in peacetime, it's murder, and you can't do it. Now, unfortunately, there's been a substantial breakdown in distinction between war and peace in the last 10 or 15 years. for three reasons. One is the ubiquity of low-level local conflicts, of which the Ukraine issue is certainly one. It's certainly conflict, but is it war or peace? It's not exactly clear. The second is terrorism. Is a terrorist attack means that the origin, the source of the terrorist attack, you're in a state of war with them? Not necessarily. And so that's been very indefinite, and we don't know whether to apply, under what conditions you could use things they could only use in wartime against terrorists. And the third is cyber, where cyber, of course, has a whole range of a scale of effects, from very small things or to possibly much larger things than we've ever seen before. And that really blurs the distinction between war and peace. With kinetic attacks, that kinetic means boom, explosives. If you bomb somebody's bridge, that's an act of war. But with cyber, it's not clear exactly how big it is. I mean, the DNC attack presumably is not an act of war. Was the Stuxnet attack? I think Iran could have definitely said that it was if they wished to. They didn't, because they didn't have an appropriate way of responding, so they didn't. Now, in the case of the power grid attack, it is the first established attack against civilian infrastructure. It was in the context of fighting, and the scale of it was 230,000 people lost electricity for 1 to 6 hours. Now, what's the scale of that? Well, the Ukrainian Electricity Commission said that the outage was equivalent to not 1% of the Ukrainian electric consumption, not even 1/10%, but 100% of Ukrainian daily electricity production was outed. So in that sense, it's a pinprick, although it certainly got a huge amount of international attention. So what's, well, the attribution, as Nadiya was saying, is difficult in terms of how high a political responsibility from Russia is involved in this. It appears that the level of sophistication was meant that it would probably have involved some professional hackers, and probably, I would guess, beyond the criminal units, and therefore probably had some Russian involvement, but it's not clear because it could have been not necessarily, it could have been Russian, but not necessarily government, because it was the motivation is not clear. In particular, when you see that it was this relatively small effect, one wonders what the point of it was. It appears to be larger than just hacktivism, that is to say some Russian patriots took it upon themselves to mess up something in Ukraine. It looks like it's more than that. It did involve what most people would call a zero-day exploit, but in this case it was a 400-day exploit. And what I mean by that, zero-day exploit is something that's never been seen before. First time it's used, therefore it's a sign of skill and vulnerability that hasn't been detected before. Well, the vulnerability that this was based on was in Windows systems that had been seen 15 months earlier and been used several times. So what does that indicate? It indicates that computer hygiene is not very good. And this is very common, and people have already remarked on this, that much of the vulnerability of computer systems is because people and institutions really are unbelievably careless. In retrospect, when you do an audit and you look and see how did they do that, you see, as Alex was saying, in the example of DNC, it was just total incompetence. And that's true in a lot of other attacks. So it wasn't an instance where the perpetrators, presumably Russians, were exploiting, were letting loose something that had been seen before, suggesting that they were willing to pay the price of losing that ability to exploit in the future. In fact, it was something that had been used over and over again and still hadn't been patched. The purpose, it seems to me, most likely was some version of warning, some version of saying we could do more than we're doing unless you don't stop some things that you're doing, either in the past or the future. And in that sense, it's a wake-up call about how civilian infrastructure could be attacked. And it's not clear whether it could have been attacked at a much larger scale, and therefore what the intention was. There were several other electric companies in Ukraine that were attacked but didn't seem to do any damage. It didn't get all the way to customers. So my guess is that it's a matter of the Russians issuing a warning that they could do more of this, but even that's not certain. So this is a place where the boundary between war and peace are vague. Attack on civilian infrastructure was of international significance and yet was small scale. And what we can learn from this is that several lessons. One is that that systems that you would think should be well protected aren't. And the reason they're not is carelessness or inadequate attention to security. And that is so ubiquitous. It's not just in Ukraine and not just in the DNC, but everywhere else, except perhaps the financial system, which has always been very alert to people trying to steal money from banks. And so that system, we hope, is a little better than maybe the stock exchange. But a lot of other things are not. The second thing we can learn is that that there's a serious possibility that various norms will be impinged upon in ambiguous ways, and ambiguous in the sense of attribution, ambiguous in the sense of the scale of importance. And therefore, we're always going to have to police these boundaries, both for things like the Russian attack on American election process and the attack on the Ukraine power grid, that these kinds of things are likely to continue. We have not yet developed doctrine on how to deal with it. So to compare the new technology of nuclear weapons, and after 45, it took 15 years to develop appropriate understanding of what difference nuclear weapons made. It wasn't until about 1960 that we realized that the standard military wisdom that you want to maintain flexibility, because you never know what's going to happen after an attack starts. You don't know how it's going to play out. And so you need flexibility. Well, with nuclear weapons, it took 15 years to figure out the exact opposite. You want commitment. You want to tie your hands. For example, the Americans want to keep troops in Berlin during the Cold War and not have the ability to evacuate them in a hurry. So if the Russians ever tried to conquer Berlin, they'd kill 3,000 Americans, and that would be enough for us to declare war and have a serious conflict. Whereas if we can evacuate them, maybe they could get Berlin without it. So the military doctrine turned upside down with nuclear weapons. And so we're about halfway through that 15-year period and with cyber, and we're still trying to figure out the implications of this new technology.
That's a great segue to, before we open it up to Q&A, for my last question for you, Alex. One implication of this, what Bob just outlined, would be to say, right now, everything is really vulnerable. Maybe we should leave everything really vulnerable because it'll create this mutual vulnerability regime and that will deter everybody. But unlike nukes, it's not only the most sophisticated states that can actually build nukes, right? It's like also a sophisticated hacker who can do a lot of damage. We've spent the last half hour talking about diplomacy. You are on North Campus at the Computer Science Department, which to me feels kind of like Silicon Valley. Whenever I go to North Campus to see you, I have to switch and talk about information or computer security and not cybersecurity. What is your sense of how much difference do you think the diplomatic efforts are going to make when it comes to actually improving this security environment and the online security environment? And what do you think will be the main drivers for improving the situation in the coming years?
Wow, well, that's an enormous question with a lot to unpack. But since I'm standing in the way of our Q&A, and I'm sure the audience has a lot of good questions, let me just take a few small aspects of that. So I think going back to what Bob was saying, yes, there's a tremendous amount of carelessness and low-hanging fruit in security. But at the same time, I think that the militarization, if you will, of cyberspace, the trend towards using attacks on security for military or statecraft purposes by nation states is still an enormous threat and an enormous cost. And I want to focus a little bit on those costs because, yes, there are other implications too, but the costs of having to defend against state-level threats or something that's borne by society at large. So typically security, in my view, is an equilibrium between, or something like an equilibrium between the cost of defending yourself and the risk that you're going to be attacked, right? And we're going to only pay for as much defense as we need. So some of that sloppiness that we see is because, well, adopting secure techniques is harder and it raises the cost of your product or lowers the competitiveness of your company somewhat unless everyone else is doing it. And so people will pay for the amount of defense they need. But the militarization, if you will, these new forms of attacks raise the amount of defense that we all are going to need to pay for eventually. Even just the threat of attacks like the DNC raises that bar. And not only does it raise the costs for everyone, it potentially is going to lead to arms race situations between nation states, both in terms of the development of offensive capabilities and the beefing up of domestic security in response to those. And I think this is likely to be a form of overinvestment in security as opposed to what would be needed without the nation-state threats. Another factor that raises costs is this dual role that states play in developing cyber arms and offensive capabilities and also trying to defend domestic systems creates conflicting roles for government, and conflict, in fact, between the interests of government, sometimes at least with the offensive hat on, and the role of private industry in trying to secure software products, hardware products, and systems. If government is reserving certain attacks for its offensive use, well, those aren't attacks that government is helping industry defend against necessarily. So yes, there are things we absolutely need to defend, critical infrastructure, and I would include in that the election system to bring us full circle, where relatively low-cost defenses like having paper ballots available and then having routine audits of them can provide a fairly strong level of defense, but raising the bar for all applications, for everyone's email, for everyone's personal security and private information that might be leaked in order to manipulate the politics or the marketplace, that is going to be enormously expensive and in some forms wasteful if that's not yet what we need. So in security, we have so much to worry about already without also having to worry about, in addition, potentially very sophisticated nation-state attacks. And I think diplomacy needs to be part of the solution. What I think is necessary includes stronger red lines about what attacks will justify a strong government response. Maybe some more efforts towards cyber arms reduction, if you will, to try to break this cycle of arms races and investment in offense. And I don't know how much has been conceptualized in the world of policy and diplomacy about cyber peace, and but maybe naively, I hope someday we can get to a world in which that is our goal. But I think we're a long way away. And I look forward to increased interaction between people who are working on the diplomatic front and people who are working on the technical front in terms of understanding attacks and defenses.
Great. With that, I'd like to open it up to any questions you might have. We have another, I think, 5 to 10 minutes. I think 5 is what we have. So, yeah, in the back. And if you could please make sure to introduce yourself quickly with your name. And make sure it's a question and not a comment. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Haney. I'm the Assistant Systems Administrator for Crime Research North America, right on the corner. I was wondering if you've heard of a Wi-Fi pineapple and if you have any comments on about
Drew, what's that?
The one that allows, that will pretend to be the network you're asking for.
It takes advantage of basically just move from all mobile devices and sneaks in as a previously known access point.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, to contact them, and I thought you were probably the best person to ask.
Well, let's talk after the panel. Yeah.
Any other questions? Drew?
I've just got a question about what the role of non-state actors is with regard to the norms process or with regard to attribution, because with the exception of some of the very small, or excuse me, not very small, with the exception of some of the more esoteric attacks, things like the Podesta phishing, things like even the Maurer botnet, non-state actors have state-level capabilities with some regards and how that affects.
That's a great question.
So,
Oh,
so I think from a diplomatic perspective, so primarily our conversation around responsible state behavior, around norms of in cyberspace and responsible state behavior generally, has focused on states. I think part of the view here is that this is, this is what diplomacy is about. It's about, this is engaging among states about what we can do. That isn't to say that within the context of that discussion, there isn't some discussion of non-state actors. In particular, we focused on the issue of proxies. That in many cases, there's the concern that non-state actors will be acting as non-state actors, but in fact be acting on the behalf of a state. And so we've tried to make very clear within that discussion that that states are responsible for activities carried out by non-state actors on their behalf. There's also been some discussion about responsibility of states to respond to requests for assistance, when there's malicious activity emanating from their borders. So, those are the types of places where we've talked about that, and that would apply to state or non-state actor activity, obviously occurring within their borders. More broadly, of course, cybercrime is one of the big areas where we work on the issue of non-state actors, since a lot of activities by non-state actors is criminal in some way or another, and so there the focus has been on trying to harmonize laws so that what's a crime in the United States is a crime in some other country where a hacker might be located, and creating procedures for us to be able to cooperate in doing investigations and sharing evidence. So I'd say the issue of non-state actors, I think we end up getting at it from a few different sort of perspectives, and those are a few of them.
Let me expand on the principle that you mentioned that's widely accepted, that states are responsible for at least trying to stop activities that are belligerent that come from their territory. That's widely accepted, and so the example is the Russians have said to the FBI, here's some people that we want you to investigate and deal with so that they're not bothering us anymore coming from your territory, and we've given the Russians a list of some things coming from Russia that we want them to do. Now, that's a good idea, but here's where reciprocity breaks down, because I've heard from a responsible source that the FBI, in dealing with all the complaints they have from banks and private industry and individuals about things the FBI should investigate, that they tend to prioritize by the scale. So if you've lost $1,000, the FBI is going to give low priority. If you've lost 100 million, they'll give it a high priority. And the scale of the things that the Russians complain about are not the largest scale, and they never get to the top of the list of the very few things they're able to investigate in detail. So we're not doing our part, according to the source, to maintain the credible investigations of the things that other countries said, well, at least Russia complains about, and so it's no surprise that they don't prioritize the things we complain about, and that's something I think could be improved, changing the sense of priority for our own investigations.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm Chris Sorensen. Pardon me, my coffee sent me down. I am from industry. I am a senior cybersecurity researcher at GE Digital. I've been in IT for 30 years, about 10 of them in security. I've done a bunch of technical roles. I've done a bunch of compliance and risk roles, threat intelligence roles. I wrote a briefing 2 years ago on the climate. So if you want to talk about that afterwards, I'm happy to do that. And I also spent time on North Campus recruiting people. I need to hire buckets of cyber security people. So does everybody, right? Can you comment, all of you, on the state of education and training in cyber, and not just the technical stuff, which I love, but managerial, policy, all of those areas. Thank you.
And if you want to sneak in your final remarks into your response, that way we wrap up the panel.
Maybe I can go first and just
Yeah,
speak
please.
on the technical side. And I think certainly we need more cybersecurity education in computer science. Everyone who is going on to write software should know at least something about the security implications of the decisions they make. That just is common sense, I think. And our students are picking up on that, though. So over the 8 years that I've been teaching here, the undergraduate security course that we teach has gone from 50 students a year electing to take it to about 750 students a year electing to take it. That's a good introduction to the security mindset and to the first thing someone needs to know. The problem is that having taken an introductory course is obviously not enough to make someone an expert. And we need better resources available to take people to the next step. I don't think we have the capacity right now to train the number of true experts that we need. But we do have the capacity to give people the basics and a little sense of the mindset. And we're doing a fairly good job of that now at Michigan, I think, thanks to the student interest. But in terms of, you mentioned managerial and other aspects of other people who need to have some awareness of cyber concepts. And I think there is more room for that too. Maybe I'll let others speak to what we may be doing here at Michigan. Although, just to take this back to my last point though, the necessity of everyone being cyber aware is an unfortunate part of the cost of large-scale attacks, and I wish that were less necessary than it is. I think, in a sense, we're still in the backyard bomb shelter phase of cyber, that everyone needs to go out and dig a bomb shelter personally because of the risk of attack. Well, it shouldn't be that way. We need more of a collective form of defense that will shift some of those costs away from everyone having to make that investment.
At the international policy level, there's a very unfortunate divide between people who are technically skilled and people who are politically sophisticated. The people who are technically skilled usually come from an engineering background, and their understanding of diplomatic history, of deterrence, and of how policy is made at the national and international level is usually pretty thin. On the other side, the people who are sophisticated at the political, diplomatic, and policy areas are often intimidated from getting into computer security issues because they're afraid that the level of technical competence needed before they stop looking really naive is just too great. And so that's different, again, from the nuclear era, because what a political scientist needed to know to think about deterrence is that one missile can destroy one city. That was all you really needed to know. And you didn't have to know how to make an A-bomb or an H-bomb, or how a rocket really worked, or how the guidance system worked. But with cyber, it's different. I think you do need to know something about the details of how you do, of what makes an attribution possible or impossible is largely, is initially a technical question and later becomes a political question about responsibility. So I think that's a tremendous gap, a tremendous specialization, that barrier that really hasn't been crossed very well, with very few exceptions on either side. I've done my tiny bit by teaching a course on cyber conflict where I have about 2/3 master's students in public policy and about 1/3 computer scientists, and I have them do projects together so they learn to talk to each other. But it's a very small scale thing, and I hope that there could be more of that around the country.
And if I can add, so I'm in a joint program in political science and public policy, and but I always introduce myself as a person who does cybersecurity policy, because when I say I do political science, people tend to think that I'm doing traditional conflict or political economy stuff. But going to different conferences and different events, I've noticed there are a lot of people who are similar like me, who are in political science programs or public policy schools, but they are trying to get some knowledge, do some research about this new, very fascinating and emerging field. And our approach usually is to go everywhere on campus you can. And in Michigan, I attend Alex's security reading group. I try to attend events at the School of Information and the Communication department. So I try to find any person who can help me and learn from them. And this is what I think a lot of people are doing. But also there are programs, I would say, around the world who specialize in this. And one of the really good programs is at Oxford, which is called Internet Studies. And what they actually do, their requirement is when you apply, is either you have to have a bachelor's in computer science and have, let's say, some minor in political science, or vice versa. So you have to have some kind of substantial knowledge in one of the field and small knowledge in the other. It's just, I think these are the nascent steps, but there's a lot of promise. And there are a lot of people who are really eager to learn and want to learn, and they try to find the resources. I think that I've seen this development during the last 3 years. So when I started my program, there were very few people who were doing it. Now it's like more and more of us want to get involved. So I think because the field is developing so much quicker, there will be a lot of changes in terms of the programs and master's programs and doctoral programs, and maybe we're going to have a PhD in cybersecurity policy one day.
When I joined my office 3.5 years ago, everybody, and I think there wasn't a person in my office at the State Department who could say that they planned to end up in cyber as a career. We'd all, we all had a specialty. I started out as a lawyer, doing what lawyers do, and I ended up in a practice that was basically applying the legal skills. Often it was figuring out how old laws like wiretap laws from the 1980s applied to 21st century technology. I was lucky to have in private practice a mentor who had pioneered in the area, and at the State Department, I'm lucky to work for two. Our coordinator, Chris Painter, who was prosecuting cyber crime in the 1980s and 90s, and our deputy coordinator, Michelle Markoff, who has a nuclear deterrence and strategic studies background, who got interested in computers in the 1990s and kind of dreamt up this whole concept of responsible state behavior and our entire framework. So I think when I started out, it was very much learning from the people who were there. We were all policymaker types and picking up the technology as we go. The nice thing is that in the last year or two, we've been able to start hiring people into our office who actually studied this in graduate school. And I've also seen that these programs are beginning to pop up thanks to people like you. This is a 21st century issue. I just suspect that this is going to be, I can imagine at law schools that this is just going to be a part of what you learn when you're a lawyer. Just like as a lawyer, you're going to have to be better at securing your documents if you want to maintain attorney-client privilege. I think, as you say, unfortunately, it's going to become a necessary life skill in a range of professions. Learning about it as a policy matter, I think, hopefully you will help save the day in that regard.
And if you are not a student and have a chance to either participate in Bob's or Alex's class, I encourage you to attend future events of the Dissonance event series, because I think that's part of the aim of what Sol and Joel and Alex are trying to do with this event series. And with that, please join me in thanking the terrific panels, and thank you all for coming today. Thank you.